Hi, I'm going to talk about powers, the powers that are currently about to be implemented at Westminster, at Holyrood, and also the debate about the additional powers which will be addressed, maybe not resolved, by the Smith Commission. So, first off, let's talk about the Scotland Act. Scotland Act 2012 has introduced power over 3 taxes to Scotland. We haven't really seen the effects of that yet because it's taken some time to introduce them. The taxes are the landfill tax, the land and buildings transactions tax, which is the equivalent of stamp duty, and the Scottish rate of income tax. Those 3 taxes have been in the process of being implemented in Scotland, and we'll actually start to see some evidence of that, I think, in Thursday's budget. So the landfill tax and the land and building transaction tax are expected to raise relatively small amounts of money. 107 million for the landfill tax, 413 million for the land and building transactions tax. The key one is the Scottish rate of income tax, which will raise about £4.7 billion, making a total of new taxes coming to the Scottish Parliament of £5.2 billion worth. Remember, total spending in Scotland by the Scottish Government is around £30 billion. And Scotland already has a couple of taxes, business rates and the council tax, which raise between them around £4 billion. So this would take the total to around £9 billion out of the £30 billion. So the landfill tax and the land and building transaction tax are going to be implemented by a new body called Revenue Scotland that has been set up for the purpose. The Scottish rate of income tax will be collected by HMRC, as income tax has always been collected, but some of it will be sent to Scotland, depending on whether you are classified as a Scottish income taxpayer or a rest of UK income taxpayer, and we'll find that out from our tax assessments. So, how does the Scottish rate of income tax work? Well, imagine that you earn £100,000 a year. The first £10,000 of that will be tax-free, or close to £10,000, so you won't pay any tax on that. The first chunk of income that you have between 10 and 32,000, you'll pay income tax at the rate of 20 pence in the pound. Between 32 and actually 150, so I've been quite modest about the amount of money that you actually earn. You pay income tax at 40 pence in the pound. If you had earned over 150, you would pay the additional rate, which is 45 pence in the pound at the moment. And the way the Scottish rate of income tax works is that 10 pence of that, 10 pence band, will be a slab. That slab will be assigned to the Scottish Government. So this is where my £4.7 billion comes from. It's that slab of income tax. Important things to notice are that the Scottish Government is not choosing where the allowance starts, so it's not deciding on the 10k, and it's also not deciding on the steps between the different rates of income tax. So it's not setting progression, as it's called. It's not setting how much the relatively rich pay compared to the relatively poor. Of course, most people don't pay income tax. I'll come back to this issue of vertical and horizontal tax competition in a later slide. So it's a bit of a nerdy topic. I'll talk about it a little bit later. The Labour proposal can be easily shown on this slide because it says, let's not have 10 pence, let's have 15 pence. So it increases the proportion up to 15 pence. Now, Liberals and the Conservatives are saying complete power over income tax, which would mean not only setting the allowances, but also the progression. So you would have all of the different parts of income tax underneath your control. Well, this refers really to what Michael's just been talking about. The key to all of this is how the Barnett formula is then adjusted. So £4.7 billion or 5.2 has been taken out of it. How is the Barnett formula going to be adjusted after this? Is it going to have exactly that same amount taken out of it each year? What's going to happen? Well, suppose this is year one. What we would expect is that the block grant would be reduced, and in the first year it will be reduced by an amount that would exactly offset the amount of money that Scotland is raising in the Scottish rate of income tax. So Scotland's no better off, no worse off. So it faces no risk in the first year, no change in revenue. That's the Scottish rate of income tax. That's our £4.7 billion. One of Richard's colleagues in Wales has invented a method called the index deduction method, which is another nerdy concept, but that's the way that the block grant is going to be adjusted. So what will happen, to put it broadly, is that the amount of reduction in the block grant will be proportional to the growth in the UK income tax base. So if the UK is growing fast, there will be more taken out of the Scottish block grant. So what's the incentive for the Scottish government? The incentive is for it to grow as fast or indeed faster. So there is now more of a reward for the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish government, to get the Scottish economy growing faster, because if it does so, it will increase the revenues that are available to it. It has to grow faster than the economy of the rest of the UK. The size of that risk and reward that it faces will increase with the proportion of the tax that it gets. So if it was only getting 1% of the tax, of the income tax take, it wouldn't be facing much risk and reward. 10 pence, reasonably significant. 15, more so. The full set of income tax powers, clearly, the risk reward stakes go higher still. So that's essentially what I was saying. There's a shortfall of income tax. It's not growing as fast as the UK income tax rate. So you can't be sure in the future whether you're going to get £30 billion or not. Further proposals for tax devolution. These are the major taxes raised in Scotland. That's the estimates made by HMRC for different taxes and what proportion of them are raised in Scotland. What I've done here is to show the Devo More, the Devo Plus, the Scottish Conservative and the Liberal Democrat proposals, because I've already covered Labour. And some of these, for example, income tax, we raise slightly less per head than is the case in the UK as a whole. VAT is pretty much the same. We raise slightly less on national insurance contributions and so on. I guess the key numbers are the ones down the left-hand column, which shows how much money each of these generates in Scotland. And income tax is the big player here, £10.9 billion in 12-13. So one way of thinking about this is to say, well, suppose you did go well beyond the simple set of taxes that are already on their way to Scotland through the Scotland Act, and you took, for example, the Conservative proposals, the Devo More, the Devo Plus proposals. Where would that place us on an international context compared with other sub-central governments? I'll just call it a sub-central government because I don't think I'll offend anybody if I call it that. So what this graph does is to look at, on the horizontal axis, the expenditure share that different countries' sub-central governments control, and then the revenue share. So most sub-central governments spend more than they raise in taxes because they're all below the 45-degree line here. The UK, so some allow very little revenue raising at all, like Greece, Ireland, and the Netherlands. The UK is pretty low in terms of the amount of tax raising power it gives to sub-central governments. And these are really the powers I've already mentioned, business rates and council tax. As you increase, say, the share coming to Scotland to the, the UK gives Scotland more powers over spending than it does local government. So Scotland is somewhat different already in that it has more revenue spending capability, but not much more tax capability. The Scotland Act increases the revenue raising, but doesn't change the spending powers. Scottish Labour increases somewhat the revenue raising and somewhat the spending powers, because they're proposing that housing benefit and attendance allowance welfare measures are included in their proposal. The Conservatives takes it further still with complete power over income tax. Devo More and Devo Plus throw in some additional taxes like capital gains tax and so on. So they take it even further still. And so we'd be moving quite far out on the kind of international framework if you went to some of these the proposals like Devo More and Devo Max. Let me just make clear, however, where we are in relation to tax revenues in total in Scotland. So that is the block that we've got from income tax. That's the starting point. There's national insurance, both pretty predictable, both very flat. Add in VAT, increased a bit since 9-10 because the rate of VAT was increased in the first budget post the last election. Other taxes are a whole bunch of little things which together add up to quite a lot. Well, one could argue about them till the cows come home. They're not the huge players. They won't make a huge difference. There's corporation tax, which I do include, although it's quite small, because it's a power that's often focused upon for the Scottish Parliament. And there's North Sea oil. That adds in both quite an amount of money, but also quite a bit of volatility in terms of tax revenue. And then here's what is spent in Scotland. This is what's called total managed expenditure, the equivalent of where Scotland is in relation to the amount of of the total UK public spending bill. A lot of assumptions in there, but happy to discuss. That's the fiscal deficit. The difference between those two comprises the fiscal deficit. That's around £10 billion in the last year. 1 pence on the basic rate of income tax raises between 200 and 400 million pounds. So that's the kind of order of magnitude increases in income tax raise. Let me talk a little bit about the quota, because that's of interest. If you went for, say, the Basque Country solution, where you effectively have all powers devolved to the sub-central government, and the Basque Country makes a payment to the Madrid government. It's called the quota. One of the problems about that as a model is that at the moment, Scotland wouldn't be making a payment because it couldn't afford to. The tax revenue raising powers at the moment aren't sufficient to do that. So that raises the question of, so you want to maintain public spending and you've devolved everything to Scotland, the only way that the money could be raised would be through borrowing. And so part, I think, of what the Smith Commission has to look at is borrowing powers and how borrowing powers would be handled. Would it be through the Debt Management Office in the UK, or would Scotland issue its own debt? Then the issue about how does that debt, how is that considered? Is it considered as part of UK debt, which would mean that there would effectively the Treasury would bail Scotland out if circumstances got very tough? Or is there what we would call a no bailout clause? So that would be a hard constraint that Scotland would have to borrow, but then live with the consequences of that borrowing. All of this would imply the replacement of the Barnett formula, but this is very confusing. The parties say the Barnett formula will stay, so this is not at all clear. So let me go in the right direction. The final slide. What additional taxes? How extensive will control be? Because it's not just the rates, it's the tax base, it's how you set the allowances that matter. Also, the possibility of sharing taxes hasn't really been discussed all that much. What are the constraints on the exercise of power? Vertical tax competition is two bodies competing for the same tax base, so that's the UK and Scotland competing over the income tax base, or horizontal tax competition, Scotland competing against the rest of the UK to get the lowest rate of income tax so that they get good people or a flow of migrants into Scotland to increase the economy. Two final points, and this leads on to Nicola quite well. I don't tend to talk to students about using tax powers specifically to increase economic growth. I talk about productivity, I talk about research and development, infrastructure and stuff like that. So maybe the Unionist Party should be prepared to seek control over welfare to refocus people on social justice rather than on economic growth, because partly the story has been about economic growth. Okay, thank you. Sorry I took too long.
Thank you very much, David.